Hello, I'm Dave Gray, and as some of you know, I've been working on a book for quite a while now, a little over a year. It started out as a book with the title Principles of Agility, and it has now become Liminal Thinking. And that's a whole long story for another time. But today, I would like to introduce you to a guy named Mike Parker. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Dave.
Good to see you today.
Good to see you too. How are you?
Excellent. Mike is on Twitter. He is Sysparatem at Sysparatem. Well, let's just start by I'll ask you, Mike. What is that? Where does that name come from? It's a very curious and interesting Twitter handle.
It has its roots in my lifelong fascination with systems thinking, and so that's the sys part, and para stands for above, so looking at meta systems, and atem is meant to be all of everything.
So looking at all of everything and systems of systems and the
right.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. So no small challenge there.
It's just a question of scale. I mean, you could get just as detailed down at the micro level.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I wanted to talk to you today about was this concept that you've shared with me called the blank sheet of the mind. And I love that concept coming from having been an artist myself and started out in that realm. I've always loved the idea of the blank sheet as a place of infinite possibility and beginnings. What do you mean when you say the blank sheet of the mind?
Right. Well, this was a meta when we were discussing the use of guided visualization dates in the liminal coaching work, and I think that I was trying to describe the fact that I think that there is a common fundamental substrate to all of the different meditative reverie, daydream, and trance type practices that we see from a whole range of different sources. So my feeling was, for example, if you take mindfulness meditation, I would think of that as being a particular kind of drawing on this blank sheet. And I believe the blank sheet is where the mind actually turns in and starts looking at itself. It's an initial state which is common, I think, to all forms of meditation, reverie, daydream, and trance states.
Well, tell us about it. How do you encounter this, or how do you invoke this initial state?
Well, there's any number of different ways of doing that because it's incredibly common. We actually drop into that state something like 75 times a day. I think that's what the latest brain scanning research seems to show. And it has some interesting similarities with rapid eye movement, sleep state as well.
So what are the characteristics of it? How do you know that or do you know when you're in this blank sheet state?
Sure. If you've ever driven home and not quite realized how you've got there, then you've been in reverie, or you've been in what some people refer to as trance or daydream. And that is that kind of state. And likewise, if you're daydreaming, and I'm sure all of us have done that, same thing. Also, if you happen to be stuck with a very boring after-dinner speaker, you're quite likely zoning out, and you're in the same state again there.
So keep going.
Sorry, it's really very, very common. That's the thing. But the reason why I think that describing it as a blank sheet of paper is significant is that it actually differentiates the drawing of a particular kind of mental discipline, of meditation or trance or whatever. It differentiates that drawing from the fundamental mechanism. And I think that's important because it actually means that it's possible to draw anything on that blank sheet. It doesn't have to be a particular kind of meditation. It doesn't have to be in a given tradition. You don't have to be using a given tradition in order to actually utilize that state.
Okay, so what does it mean? I mean, what when you say when I want to, let's say I want to pick up a pencil or a pen and I want to start drawing on the blank sheet of my mind, what is the purpose of that kind of activity? What would be the goal? Or is it just like doodling? There isn't necessarily have to be a goal, and that you have this blank sheet that you can scribe on what you will.
It could be either. So it could be as formal and as articulate as an attempt to do a photographically real drawing, or it could be as free and as emergent as just doing a doodle, as you say, or a piece of abstraction and just seeing what comes out of it.
So what are these drawings? Are these drawings us imagining, the future, or we're remembering the past, or observing what's around us? I mean, when we're drawing on the blank sheet of the mind, what are we actually doing?
I think it could be any of those things, but to my mind at the moment, and I would stress that this is an emergent and exploratory discourse we're talking about here. Um, at the moment, I would consider it to be the framework which gets put on top of the blank sheet of paper. So, for example, it could be any belief, it could be any kind of parameter which describes a given mental state. There was a guy who's famous back in the late 70s. I think they called him the Dolphin Man, Dr. John C. Lilly, and he once described a principle quite interestingly by saying, in the realms of the mind, what one believes to be true either is true or becomes true within limits to be determined by experiment and experience. And I think that gets pretty close to how I think of doing a drawing on the blank sheet of the mind.
Can you think of an example maybe that all of us might be familiar with about when we already do this? If an example of what it looks like when you draw on the blank sheet of your mind.
I guess that, for example, if you know how in drama and theatre and film we you have that idea of the suspension of disbelief,
Hmm.
and I think that that's a good example of where what you do is you actually start drawing the space of the story on the blank sheet of your own mind, and then you become involved in it and you become engaged in it, and you start feeling like you're actually living it a little bit, even if it is somewhat by proxy.
So I go to a Spider-Man movie and I sit back and I relax and I get my popcorn and I sit back and I basically invite the director and the actors and the creator of the movie to just write on my blank sheet. I expose my blank sheet and
I think if you really want to enjoy it, yeah. I mean, but obviously you can sit there and you can watch any performance and analyze it and critically take it apart, and that might be your way of enjoying it. But that would put you in a very different drawing to somebody who's actually just enjoying watching the movie.
Yeah, I've heard filmmakers actually say that to some degree, when you know the magic behind the scenes, it can be harder to enjoy a movie. It can actually take away, or film critics even will say that sometimes it's harder to enjoy the movie because they are engaged in a different kind of participation in it.
Well, they're all great candidates for guided relaxation. They could probably really benefit from that.
Hmm. Okay, well, let's go in that direction then. Why should someone care about this approach to the blank sheet of the mind? Why would your average person care about becoming more intentional about this part of their mental world?
Good question. I think because it can give you access to the capabilities of the unconscious. So we know that people who are in this kind of state, in this sort of reverie, they can, for example, be able to remember things that they couldn't recall previously, and they're also capable of coming up with intuitive insights and solutions much more quickly than the rational, conscious part of the mind can. So there's an interesting research that's been done by Rachel and Schulman, And it used to be thought prior to about 2000, prior to their research, it used to be thought that when the brain was in the so-called idle state, it wasn't doing anything and it wasn't using up very much energy. I believe Rachel and Shulman were actually investigating something else when they actually discovered that in these states of reverie or daydream or whatever we want to call it, the brain could be seen to be using up to 20 times as much energy as in normal focused consciousness. So there's actually a huge amount going on there. And I don't think that we understand an awful lot of exactly how what goes on, but we do know that people who access that state through reverie or daydream are capable of being able to access huge solution creation capabilities very rapidly. So that there's an interesting story about Einstein's school report, which at one point had written on it, seems to spend most of his time daydreaming. Right. I wonder what was going on there. Or perhaps we've just seen a little tip of what was going on there while he was daydreaming.
It's interesting what you say about the idea of a movie or being a way of kind of inscribing ideas on a mind. And I know that if I read a book, I've thought before that the process of opening a book is really opening your mind to letting the author kind of run a program on your mind, using your mind. And it's sort of interesting to me to think, okay, well, if an author can do that for me, or a filmmaker can do that, and I can open myself up to inviting them to inscribe ideas on my mind, why wouldn't I also want to consider doing that for myself? I mean, we all know that a film or a novel can have profound impact on social change, even as something, a speech, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech comes to mind. Kennedy had a speech about, going to the moon. I think there's something very, very powerful about that ability to move people, to actually create social change through whatever those things might be, whether they're speeches or films or novels or stories that really move people and create emotional connection and drive change.
Yeah, that's true. It's a dual-edged sword, though. I've got to remember that. One of the ways in which we actually go into this state is what's called the orientation response. So when something happens that you're not expecting and it doesn't fit in with the pattern that you're currently running to interpret reality, you actually drop into this state and you go and do rapid pattern matching, which is one of the things that happens in this particular state of mind. During that time, you have got heightened suggestibility, and that's one of the qualities of this particular state. And there are advertising companies out there that deliberately structure advertisements in such a way as to create orientation response and then immediately suggest the purchase. And likewise, I think that skilled political campaigners and designers of political campaigns will do the same sort of thing. So I actually think that from the point of view of recognizing how that mechanism may be being used generally, it's probably a good thing to know about. But from another perspective, I think it's also an incredibly useful thing to know about, because because you're in a state of greater suggestibility and you do have access to the unconscious in this kind of state, you can actually do some deliberate rewiring of patterns of thought or patterns of response that you may have identified that you have yourself that you don't particularly like, or that you want to change, or that you want to improve on.
So what can it do for me if I want to do this? What kind of things might I expect if I start? I mean, it almost sounds, when you talk about it that way, it almost sounds like it's not just a blank sheet, but it's like a photographic plate or a negative, or what's the blank film where you snap a.
I think the blank sheet was a metaphor that I was using in some discussions that you and I were having about about similarities and differences between different practices which seem to use a common basic state. So we've gone a little bit further on from that, looking at particular applications and looking at some of the qualities. And so I would describe some of the things that we've been talking about as the types of drawings that you can do on the blank sheet. And one of the drawings, of course, which interests me because I do the coaching stuff using it, is actually working with people to tease out with them what their goals are, what they would like to achieve, and where they'd like to see change, and where they'd like to see things improve in what they do and in their environment and so on, and then use these techniques to try and help to affect those changes.
Well, this is probably as good a time as any to ask, what is it that separates what you do with from all these other mental disciplines like mindfulness, neuro-linguistic programming, hypnosis, meditation? What is it that you're doing that's the approach that you're taking that's different or unique?
So there are similarities between all of those things and the approach that I'm taking, but I think that the difference is actually down to the blank sheet of paper, because I recognize that the drawings which the particular person I'm working with is going to do can be completely unique, and that they can be emergent from that person's own process of what they want to do and how they want to develop their story.
So how do you find that inner artist? How do you find that creative person? So if I'm going to draw, if I have a blank sheet in my own mind and I'm going to start to draw intentionally on it and create opportunities and ideas for myself, how do you find that part of me that is the artist that's drawing on the blank slate? How do you connect with that person?
To some extent, we've kind of covered that a bit already. There's a whole range of different ways of reaching into that relaxed state of mind, that reverie state of mind. And that's usually where the creative element emerges and starts working.
Okay, why does it work?
Why does it work? That's a really good question, and that reminds me of one of the recent maps I was drawing of the brain, which has a big box off to the side of what we do know, which says this is the other 85 to 90% of the brain, and it does the most amazing and extraordinary things, and we don't fully understand how it does it yet, which I think or something like that. And I think that's true, but what we do know is that when we access that state, we can manage to make that work for us in a whole range of different ways.
Do you have a mental model or some kind of mental picture about how all these things work together? I know you've drawn this diagram for me about the different aspects of the brain, and I mean, can you go kind of walk through that model for us?
The basic model that I use when I'm doing the coaching using this technique is that of the prefrontal cortex, which is the bit we think of as I, the bit that you and I are using to relate to each other at the moment, the bit we use to relate to the outside world. And that is usually attached to what we describe as the intellectual brain in this very simple model, which is this vast intellectual resource. And that generally tends to make a very realistic assessment of situations and sets of circumstances. And it's usually pretty positive as well. And it's extremely good at coming up with solutions, whether it comes up with them consciously, whether it appears as a result of a deliberate conscious process involving the prefrontal cortex, or whether it just appears as a sudden flash of insight or intuition. But then in addition to that, we have what we call the primitive brain, largely focused around the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus. And the primitive brain is our basic survival brain. And it sits there and it says, okay, how bad is this next set of circumstances going to be for me? So it has certain quality. It is always negative. It's quite often obsessive. It's very vigilant, and it has a very limited range of responses, which generally tend to be anger, anxiety, or depression. Especially if it sees something happen, which it thinks of as a perception of crisis.
Okay, so say I come to you, and I am interested in learning more, and I want to engage as a coach. Yeah, I want to start writing on the blank sheet of my mind. How does that work? What happens?
Well, the first thing that we would do is just have an informal chat and go over what it is you'd like to try and achieve, and what it is you're thinking of. And I would describe basically how the process works, how the sessions fit together, and if that sounds like the sort of thing that you want to do, and it's going to go to the place you feel you want to go to, then we would schedule what I describe as an initial consult. And during the initial consult, we actually go through the model of the brain that we use in a lot more detail, and describe it a lot more thoroughly. And we describe the process by which stress and tension, accumulated stress and tension, can actually interfere with the operation of the intellectual brain, and especially the larger part of it, or the more intuitive part of it. So, you know, if you're under a huge amount of stress, and you're getting anxiety, and you're getting panic attacks and stuff like that, then it actually stops the proper functioning of the higher brain, of the big intellectual brain. In fact, in extreme cases, the amount of cortisol which is released by the hypothalamus can almost completely shut down the higher brain, and that's when you get those states which you could well describe as being blind panic.
So let's say I want to become a better leader. That's my goal. I say I want to become a better leader. Well, what would happen next?
Okay, so we would go through the model of the brain, establish those as being the goals, and in the first development session after the initial consult, we would then follow pretty much a standard process. So we would look at what had been happening with you, where you felt you were in terms of achieving the things that you wanted to achieve. And then we have a section of the process which is called What's Been Good. And I ask you to tell me at least 6 to 10 things which have been great about your past week. And there's a specific reason for doing that, because we know that when you access memories of things which have been great, it actually reduces the blood flow to the amygdala, and it means that you have to be focusing on stuff which releases serotonin. So we like to get you into a bit of a positive space and a good mood to begin with, by going through the What's Been Good section. And if necessary, depending on what we've discussed, we might revise part of the model of the brain and look at how different mechanisms might be working to produce some of the effects you might have seen since the first session, or the effects that you might be seeing generally in the things that you want to change or things that you want to improve on. So you might identify, for example, that there's somebody that you find particularly irritating, who never seems to understand you, who always seems to be deliberately obstructive in your work environment. And that may be that is basically a primitive brain reaction, and we would work to try and calm that down completely, and to develop other ways of being able to relate what's happening with that person. So that might become, for example, a goal where you would say, well, I would really like to be in the situation where I had more patience and more insight, and I could actually try and understand better what this person was really saying, and arrive at a realistic conclusion of whether they really are being obstructive, and if they are, then why, and what can be done to help that situation. And then we would go through a process called scaling, where we would say, okay, so if on a subjective scale of success, where this is where you want to get to in terms of being less irritated and thinking more about how you might be able to solve the problem, looking for a solution, where would you say you were? And that forms the basis for a technique we use from solutions-focused brief therapy, which was developed by Insoo Kim Berg, which is called the miracle question. In the miracle question, we basically say, I won't go through the whole process because it can be quite complicated, but we basically say, okay, so if this is your goal and this is what you'd really like to see happen, and this is where you'd really like to be, what would be the first thing that you would notice tomorrow morning if there had been a significant improvement overnight and you woke up and a little miracle had occurred overnight and you woke up and you were a significant step closer towards that goal than you had been? And we would work with the client on that particular idea, and we would then attempt to actually narrow it right down to a specific thing that could happen in a specific place at a specific time. The reason for doing that is that it actually programs the anterior cingulate in the brain, which acts a lot like a sort of super secretary, and goes out and arranges all the resources that we're going to need to be able to do something. It gives it instructions and tells it, look, at this particular time, in this particular place, this is what we're visualizing happening. This is what we want to have happen. And then, so that is really the first half of a normal session, a development session after the initial consult.
Well, that sounds a lot like you're making a drawing on a blank sheet. I mean, that sounds a lot like a drawing, you know. But
yeah, it is.
A particular
Absolutely.
place at a particular time. I'm going to imagine and visualize this happening.
Yes, that's very true. Well, in fact, by the time we've got to asking the miracle question, we've really done an awful lot of drawing. So we've actually, I mean, introducing the model of the brain that we use, in my view, is creating a drawing. And then what's been good asking those questions also contributes to the drawing. The process of asking you where you are on a particular scale of what you want to do, that's also contributes to the drawing. So I think that we are way beyond the blank sheet of paper by the time we get here.
Okay. So once we've created that vivid image of this future state, then what?
That's when we actually use guided relaxation and metaphor and guided imagery and and this state of mind, which Rachel and Schulman called the default mode network, to allow all the stuff that we have just discussed and spoken about to then have direct access to the unconscious through the medium of this state of deep relaxation. And the metaphors and images that we use are deliberately generic and open and non-prescriptive. So unlike, for example, an advertiser who might try and exploit the stimulation of an orientation response to sell you a chocolate bar by saying, okay, you're disoriented, now go buy this chocolate bar immediately because that'll make you feel much better, because that's what chocolate bars do, especially our chocolate bars. So unlike that process, our aim would be to provide suggestions which say, and here in this place, you can access those resources that you have deep within yourself to solve these problems and issues, that whatever they may be, that you have brought with you. So the whole process is actually based around enabling the specific individual to access their own solutions and their own resources in a progressively increasing depth.
So in the work that you've been doing, coaching clients, what kind of results have you seen? What kind of outcomes have you seen?
Well, of course, I'm going to say brilliant, excellent outcomes. But no, they really are. And it's extremely encouraging, and it's very rewarding to see people who, in some cases, are actually are actually really, really in the grip of quite bad anxiety. Certainly in one case, and after 2 or 3 sessions, they are far calmer. They're coping far better with the stresses that they've got, and they are actually developing their own way of working with the situation and finding ways to improve it and make it better. And that's great.
Do you have any, can you make that a little more concrete? Can you give any examples?
I can. I had somebody come to see me who described their work environment as being a bit like the Battle of the Somme. As they were actually a VP in a company in the US, and they said that they were living in an atmosphere of constant fear, along with all the rest of the VPs, and summary firings were pretty common, and so on and so forth. And they were really actually extremely stressed out about it. And I think that one of the key things here is that if you're extremely stressed, you're not going to be making good decisions at all. So we went through the whole process that I've described, and after I think 2 to 3 sessions, that particular person was feeling a great deal more positive, a great deal more capable of coping with the environment, and they had a much stronger sense of themselves not being completely defined by those circumstances or that environment, but having much more ability to create their own future. And I think that that's one of the things that I've seen on a number of occasions. I'd say that's one of the signature things that I see developing in people.
So people developing a greater sense of control over their situation.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Well, so let's say I wanted to start working with you. What's the next step, or how does this begin?
Well, there are a couple of ways that you can get involved in looking at liminal coaching. So you don't necessarily have to work directly with me, although that's great if you do want to. Then there's a page on my website where you can just sign up for a free chat, and there's no obligation there at all. But there's also the liminal coaching group in LinkedIn, which you could join if you're actually interested in how we're approaching the development of liminal coaching. Then that's a great discussion to join as well. Awesome. And then, of course, because actually the theoretical roots of how I'm working are in systems thinking, they're in solutions-focused brief therapy, and a whole bunch of the other areas that you've touched on in developing liminal thinking, which is how we developed the dialogue that we have. Your own site at liminalthinking.com has got quite a lot of interesting stuff on that particular background.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So what have I forgotten to ask? What else would you like to talk about that I haven't thought to ask yet? Anything else?
Let me think. I think we've covered just about everything, actually. Unless you can think of anything else that we need to go over.
No, I think this is great.
One thing I would say is that actually that a lot of people who have come for coaching about particular work problems, work issues, or performance issues have experienced a much more general improvement in their overall well-being.
Yeah.
And because actually draining out what we call the stress reservoir can have enormous benefits in a whole range of different areas. So it doesn't just affect the work environment. It can affect family and general enjoyment of life as well. Very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. Once again, my name is Dave Gray. I've been talking to Mike Parker. You can find Mike as Sysparatam, Sysparatam on Twitter.
ATEEM, yeah.
Okay, SYSPARATEM
Yeah.
on Twitter, and Mike and I will stick around on Twitter for a while. And if you want to message us or ask us questions and mention us on Twitter, we'll be happy to take questions and answers and take it from here. So thank you so much for your time today, Mike. And
thank you, Dave. Good to speak to you.
it was great, and we'll see you. We'll see you next time.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.